Following his release from prison on Christmas Eve 1998, Ian Brown's first live appearance was with James Lavelle's dance act Uncle, providing vocals for the song Being There, which became their next single. The superficially unlikely collaboration signalled that Brown was broadening his musical horizons from the lo-fi indie pop of his debut offering. During concert appearances in 1999, he even began playing cover versions of Michael Jackson hits, particularly Billie Jean and Thriller. Despite an obvious desire to transcend his former band, his loyalty to old mates persisted. His touring band included not only Aziz Ibrahim from the post-Squire lineup, but also drummer Simon Wollstonecroft, whose involvement with Brown went way back to the days of the Patrol. This collision of the old and the new made for fascinating listening on Brown's second album, which was titled with characteristic self-confidence Golden Greats. The immediate thing to strike listeners was the serious production sheen that had been applied, in contrast to the rough and ready honesty of unfinished Monkey Business. The first single from the new album, Love Like a Fountain, hinted faintly at the percussive funk of Fool's Gold, but that was the only clear musical reference to the Roses. Too much had happened in the intervening period, not least Brown's time in prison, which he acknowledged on Free My Way with the line, "Jingle jangle, here comes the jailer." Now ringing, shimmering guitars were out, replaced by the shuffly beats of trip-hop, even adding some incongruous Middle Eastern atmospherics to the next single, Dolphins Were Monkeys. Psychedelic organs and bluesy slide guitars shook hands with ethereal samples and dance beats. Just as Ian Brown was shaking off the shackles of his previous job and setting out his stall as an artist in his own right, a persistent rumour began to circulate. The Stone Roses were going to reform. In retrospect, the basis for the gossip was flimsy in the extreme. All that had happened was that Brown had bumped into Manny in New York, and the bass player had expressed an interest in working again with his former colleague. Manny had stayed loyal to Brown even after the Reading Festival disaster, so the mutual warm feelings were no surprise. He had also remained close to Rennie. But a loose expression of enthusiasm was one thing. Reuniting the classic lineup of the Stone Roses would have required bringing John Squire back into the fold, and that seemed to be a remote prospect. What the rumours really signified was a degree of wishful thinking among fans and critics for whom the magic had drained out of music since those heady, smiley-face days a decade before. And Ian Brown had no need for nostalgia. He had his own agenda.
On a Saturday in Mexico, the women go to the market and the fellas, they all open the windows and stand in their apartments. They put the speakers on the windowsill and standing in the vest smoking on a Saturday morning, and all you can hear is music everywhere.
The embodiment of youthful swagger and surliness was, it seems, growing up a little. By now he had settled down in London with his Mexican wife Fabiola and a new son, Emilio. He'd stopped drinking and taking drugs with the exception of liberal doses of tobacco and marijuana. It was this latter indulgence, along with his wife's Hispanic heritage and Brown's own voracious appetite for reading, especially in the more obscure byways of history and spirituality, which informed his next album. Music of the Spheres was criticised in some quarters for being a hippie album. There was an element of truth in this, although it was a defiantly 21st century hippie vibe. Instrumental and songwriting assistances from people like Francis Dunnery, former leader of 80s neo-progressive revivalist It Bites, indicated that Brown had the appetite to stray well away from the usual alternative rock furrows. It was an album of varying textures, with big dense strings on FEAR, contrasting with the taut minimalism of Hear No See No. But the most important aspect of Music of the Spheres was that it demonstrated Brown's abilities as a composer and lyricist. Here was a songwriter who could indulge in cosmic contemplation with lines about being made from the same DNA as stardust, on Shadow of a Saint. But he could also deliver simple, touching love songs as he crooned on Northern Lights, You Are My Angel and My Plaything. In tribute to Fabiola, he even wrote and sang a song in Spanish, the sweet El Mundo Pequeño, or The Small World. But despite the positive reaction to his increasing commercial and critical success, there was one nagging question that seemed to blot everything else out. Would the Roses ever get back together? Of course, there were precedents. After nearly 2 decades of squabbles over money, writing credits and the correct sartorial use of the safety pin, the Sex Pistols had reformed in 1996 for the fractious, much derided but accurately labelled Filthy Lucre Tour. The Pixies, The Who and Deep Purple all put their differences behind them. Even the Police, a band whose members had barely spoken to each other during the recording of their last album, got together for an intimate gig in New York. There was clearly a desire out there to see the Stone Roses reform. As bad blood continued to keep them apart, tribute acts such as the Stoned Roses, the Clone Roses and the Stone Roses Experience were set up, copying the look and sound of the original band with varying degrees of accuracy. Probably the most convincing of the tribute acts was the complete Stone Roses. Not only did they look and sound right, but they managed to attract the best kind of endorsement from musicians who were part of the Manchester scene. Clint Boone and Tom Hingley of the Inspiral Carpets and Bez from the Happy Mondays were spotted at their gigs, as were all the ex-Seahorses with the exception of John Squire and sometimes Stone Rose Andy Cousins. Most impressively, they persuaded Manny to DJ for them on many occasions. But what exactly was the appeal of these copyists? What did audiences get from the second-hand renditions of songs they must have heard 500 times already from the constant reissues and repackagings of the Stone Roses' relatively paltry recorded output? Was it simple nostalgia for a happier time when everyone was loved up and the sun always shone? Or a reaction against the increasingly cynical and synthetic chart music, boy bands, girl bands and people from reality TV that made music by acts such as the Roses seem even more transcendently perfect? Even if the individual members of the Stone Roses weren't prepared to set all their differences aside and give the fans precisely what they wanted, maybe someone like Ian Brown could go halfway to meeting their desires. And with the unlikely help of yet another Roses tribute band, that's what he would do. But in the meantime, he had another record to make.
This is Ian Brown and let's talk about fear. Fear is about breaking down the word fear, breaking down fear in life. Fear will stop you doing things. It was about a year later and I hooked up with my pal McCracken and he had a bit of a tune going, chopped it up and I thought, you know what, them lyrics I got from about a year ago, they'll fit it. And then I figured that it'll fit in this sort of soundscape thing now.
As his 4th solo album approached, Ian Brown could look back with some level of satisfaction, having escaped the wreckage of the Roses better than any of his colleagues. Manny remained with Primal Scream, although he was strictly a supporting player to Bobby Gillespie's chemical charisma. Moreover, although the Scream maintained commercial viability and critical credibility as they reached their 20th anniversary, they never returned to the peak they reached with the Screamadelica album in 1991. Rennie, who had forsaken the drums in favour of a guitar, eventually formed a band called The Rub, but this outfit slipped off the radar around 2001. In the same year, Aziz Ibrahim released a solo album From Lahore to Longsight, featuring contributions from Paul Weller, The Smiths' rhythm section Andy Rourke, and Mike Joyce and Denise Johnson of Primal Scream. Even Cresser, the so-called associate member of the Roses, now had his own combo, Bad Man Wagon, and was also working with Irresistible Bitch, a band formed by Rowetta of the Happy Mondays.